we see so often the Peter principle play out, which is that people have been promoted based on a technical skill and are then not given any support or guidance on how to lead people. And that is not an inherently natural skill for most of us. And so what we see is these directors of work. They sit, when people are now back in office, but even virtually, they would sit over your shoulder and I remember this from being in finance. No, that's the wrong cell. No, that's the wrong formula. No, that's not how you do it. And that's how we learned. And that's what we were told by our managers. But what we really need in today's world are unblockers of work. So that if Jerome is my manager, Jerome and I have such a fluid conversation and so much psychological safety and foundational communication support that he can say, what's holding you back? And then his role is not to sit over my shoulder and direct that work. His role is to unblock that work so that I can sprint forward, so that the rest of his team can sprint forward. And people who have been promoted based on a technical skill or being really good at their, direct KPIs are not usually taught, how do I unblock for the rest of my team so that we can keep pushing forward? And I think it's a big miss.
Welcome to Narrative's Leadership Story Talks, where great leaders go beyond the bottom line to create lasting impact. Join hosts Jerome Deroy and Julienne Ryan as they uncover the stories behind real-world challenges, offering practical insights to help you lead with empathy, authenticity, and purpose. Each episode dives into how leaders use storytelling to build trust, foster connection, and inspire action. Whether you're navigating workplace dynamics, driving change, or building high-performing teams.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome Deroy, CEO of Narrative.
I'm Julienne Ryan, and excited as always to be here meeting our next guest.
Yeah, great to see you, Julienne. And yes, I'm excited as well. And before we move on to introducing our guest, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast Leadership Story Talks wherever you find your podcasts. Leave a review, and also remember that we are on our YouTube channel under Narrative, N-A-R-A-T-I-V on YouTube, and you'll be able to find lots of resources in the episode notes of this particular interview. So I encourage you to go also to narrative.com, narrativ.com/podcast, where you can also find all our previous episodes, at this point more than 150. So I'm very excited to welcome today our guest, Liz Gulliver. Liz never set out to be a founder. She was a finance kid, pre and post business school. She spent her career in banks and hedge funds. But when she found herself in a global rotational program and thinking about having kids, she realized she was struggling to find the type of leadership support and development she wanted, the kind that develops you professionally and personally. She'd never been able to watch a video or listen to a podcast and retain any valuable info. So classic LMS videos, for those of you who don't know, that's Learning Management System. Classic Learning Management System videos weren't cutting it. She wanted live learning with peers, a way to connect, to learn, to grow. That's what she and her co-founder have built Kunik to do across a range of industries and companies. She's also a mom of soon-to-be 4, and she lives in Miami, Florida, where she and her husband blend their respective New England and Argentine backgrounds to raise their kids with influences from both their childhoods. And on a personal note, what connects me to Liz is that Kunik had organized a wonderful webinar with a great panel of people, and I was fortunate enough to be on that panel. And so that started our connection here. And I've really been a big fan of you, Liz, and your work at Kunik ever since, and what everybody's doing there. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's such a nice intro. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being today. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to kick it off the way we always do, which is the way there's a question that we ask of all of our guests, and that is, what is an experience that has shaped who you are today? Something that still influences you in some way, informs your work, perhaps?
Yeah, but part of it you kind of got at in the intro, which was that I never set out to do this. Although I will say, I grew up in a family of 4 kids too, and it was a very entrepreneurial type home, which was make your own play, make your own fun, do your own thing, start your own businesses, whatever it was. So that certainly has been core from the beginning, especially on an embrace the chaos side of things. But in a work sense, it was what you described. My post MBA job was in a rotational program with a bank. If you had asked me then, I probably would have said I'll be here 15 to 20 years. But I found myself I've worked in Turkey and India and Mexico and traveling all over the place, tons of investment to get me to all of those places and learning in a hypo development program, in a women's ERG, and all of a sudden, as I started thinking about having kids, I realized despite all of this, I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know who to ask. So I was in all of these programs and they were pretty defunct. And I had no idea kind of who I can ask what really happens to your career, what do promotions actually look like after this. And so that was kind of, for me, what started this idea of, okay, there's one thing is just learning, right? The check the box, you got to learn these things. Another thing is learning in a way that really connects you to your peers. And I realized that that's what was very much lacking for me at that point in time. And that was kind of the impetus of where we started Kunik to solve for some of those challenges.
Yeah. And so I'm curious because in that intro and what you just said as well, it's clear that you put an emphasis on, not just developing professionally but also personally. I wonder, how does that sort of manifest in programs that you do with Kunik, for example? I mean, is that something that you consciously set out to do? When you work with clients, do you kind of look at both lenses, or is it more, we'll go wherever the client takes us, essentially? Or do you have to sort of advocate for things that are a little bit, beyond the kind of checking the box of training and development?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate and had three bosses that I'm still in touch with today, that I've had pre MBA, post MBA, different points along my career. And all three of them were great at pushing me into places where I felt wildly uncomfortable, but where they had confidence
Ugh.
in me, but I was in a huge stretch. And all three of them shared openly about their homes. One was Mormon, had many kids, was a huge advocate of the church. Another one had two kids and was going through a divorce and shared very openly about that. Another one was an adoptive parent, things that not all leaders are going to share and talk about. And
Mhm.
I was fortunate to work with them and hear from them. And so from very early on, I had this example of, these are people who nurtured me, who pushed me, who brought me further ahead in my career, but who also opened up a view into their world. We're vulnerable, we're authentic, all the words that we've all, heard ad nauseum now since COVID, but we're doing that, back in 2007, 2008, when nobody was talking about that. And that's just how they led. And so that was when I thought about, okay, who are the people I loved working for? Those were the people I loved working for. So when I thought about how do we change leadership in the finance industry where I was working, but in other industries as well, it really went back to that personal professional tie, because I found it very hard to separate in my mind the idea of an engaged leader not bringing both of those to the table. So when we go in and work with a company, and listen, we work with old school white shoe law firms, consulting firms, finance. We also work with super empathetic and very new world kind of tech startups. So there's a different ethos within those cultures and the way they'd approach it. But I would say we're always going to listen to the client. We're always going to take their beat on where they want to go, because we've learned you can't force a culture onto a company. So I'm not here to try and change anybody's
Mhm.
culture. I'm not going to force their culture. I think you can think about kind of overlapping circles within their culture and think about, okay, this is a work hard, get paid well. We're not bringing our politics into the workplace. We're not going to do touchy feely. We're not going to do any of those things. That is just not who we are. And you can still put into that elements and foundational parts of psychological safety, for example, to make
Mm.
sure that people feel comfortable sharing their business ideas, even if you're not getting into the who I am outside of work. That's fine. So we try and adapt to whatever the culture is, but still make sure we're putting in some foundation that allows people to really feel that at least they contribute to that culture as much as they possibly can.
Yeah.
This is so interesting, and as you're speaking, all these conversations I've had either with coaching clients or colleagues of women that had been navigating in your world of financial services, saying that at times they had to kind of almost whitewash their offices and not have pictures in it where their male colleagues had the golf and the kids and the dogs. And they were like, oh, that's so nice. There was
Totally.
like, they cleaned out anything that smacked of personal. And then also to point where you just gave great examples when I was jotting a word down when you were speaking about the different cultures you lived in and had to acclimate to. It's like that's quite a diverse selection. And then you said about your bosses, like that diversity of thought is so
Yeah.
important. And I call it story tourism because when you visit that world, you have to kind of look around and say, well, that's different. They're thinking differently. They're navigating situations much differently than I do. So you were naturally building this body of work early on. And being the
Yeah.
other is always very important, I think. We all should
Oh,
take a
nothing
trip
more powerful than doing that for a while.
do that, to
Absolutely.
see that. Thank you.
I want to take the opportunity to have you on the show to ask about trends that you're noticing, because you mentioned earlier that you in your own personal experience, the ERG, which stands for Employee Resource Groups, weren't necessarily cutting it every time, but now you're in this position where you do work with ERG leaders as well as chief HR officers, chief people officers across a variety of industries, and I'm curious at this time because there's so much. I mean, I'm going to use this word that's been used ad nauseum for now what feels like years. Uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of changes, and things that we sort of took for granted aren't. We can't really look at anything and take anything for granted anymore. And so I'm curious in this environment and over the different industries that you've worked in with the kinds of people that you've worked in, what do you find are the most kind of compelling trends in, when it comes to employee engagement, perhaps leadership development, and maybe even the shifting role of DEI, if that's even going to exist at all? I wonder what's your take on all of that, what you're noticing.
Nothing great, to be totally candid with you.
Well, that's
It's not
honest.
pretty. It's not pretty. I am not going to sugarcoat that. It is not pretty out there right now. It's tough. It's really tough. And so most of our contracts, just at a very functional side, we're mostly signed by a CHRO, sometimes a CFO. We get brought in to do work that falls under usually something around L&D. So upskilling first-time managers, executive leadership offsites, org-wide leadership development programs, that kind of stuff. We also do a lot that falls under the canopy of engagement. So that might be digging into things like wellness, stress and burnout, better question asking. I love that you asked that, Julienne. It's actually something we get asked to do a lot with interns and new hires is how do you ask better questions? Because it's not something you're weirdly taught in school. So that it all falls under engagement. And then under DEI, where we've always sat is with ERGs. So we haven't done your traditional DEI, and I think there's people who can speak much better to that, but we are seeing that DEI as it was is dead, but that ERGs are also struggling a lot and are largely unsupported and have been changed a lot. But at a super high level, it's a tough time to be a CHRO. I know, Julienne, you come from an HR background. I do not envy those CHROs right now. They've been doing so much for so long and in very tough circumstances. I think the biggest change that I've seen is the pendulum has swung from we launched in 2018. So right before COVID and then through COVID, and employees really held the upper hand. They held the balance of power. So companies were investing in things that they traditionally maybe hadn't around leadership development, around engagement, around these story points. They were willing to think outside the box. They were willing to think really hard about how do we attract, retain, and develop the best possible talent out there. That pendulum has totally shifted right now. And so we are seeing, a massive CPG company we work with we were talking with them the other day, and they're saying, we don't know totally what's going to happen with tariffs. We had a lot of things that were cut under government. We are a government contractor. We also are seeing our HR budget just totally slashed. So we had plans under it. Our DEI team is completely gone. Yeah, we would like to invest in these things, but the reality is we don't need to right now. We don't need to. We're keeping employees anyway. People don't want to leave. And so for right now, we've basically been told to just pause everything. And I think a a big friction point in attention we're picking up on is the vision of a CHRO and the vision of a CEO at a lot of companies are not lining up right now. And part of that is short-term versus long-term thinking. Part of that is shareholders or board of directors or even in a family-owned company thinking with their mindset versus thinking with the employee mindset. And so I've never really seen in the, going on 8 years now that we've been doing this, I've never seen that much tension between CHROs and their C-suite. What I will say is the companies who are still investing in a lot of leadership work, and a lot of engagement work, and a lot of ERG work, that is core to who they are. If they're doing it right now, that is not performative. That is not checking a box. That is not for show. That is who they are. They're staying true to it. They're developing in it. A big fear of mine watching this is I think ERG leaders are totally unsupported. I think that's going to backfire in a big way, especially with junior talent. We've seen this happen. The talk around AI is, of course, massive. And we worked with several companies on what that looks like and how you're implementing and what you're doing. And yet the number of people who are actually doing much with that outside of client-facing widgets, but are actually doing something internally with that is very slim across the range that we're seeing. We're also seeing that managers are flying blind. And I think that I'm terrified for these companies in 5 to 7 years when you have leadership turnovers and those are your culture carriers. Those are the people who build what performance looks like. If you want to talk about the numbers only, if you're talking profit, performance, and productivity, if you're not training your next set of managers, where do you think any of that develops in 7 years? And so that's, I think, what I'm not hearing enough people talk about, and I think it's going to become a huge issue for a lot of these ones down the line.
So many things we could go off on. I just to commend what you just said is years ago you already were flattening organizations that people didn't have hands-on managerial experience, even managing one person or two people, nothing. And then we promote them, and then they was the flipping disaster because they weren't used to that. So the people who at least were camp counselors or worked in summer jobs with staff did a better job sometimes because they actually knew
Totally.
how to move humans from point A to point B. And then technology is great. I'm not dismissing technology, but with the advent of phones and the mobile phones, people get very comfortable not having to own their dialogue or their eye contact or anything. And it created a nightmare of things that went wrong because they weren't communicating. And it's like a big, bold move to pick up the phone or show up at somebody's office or do
I
even
know.
this. So
It is. It's
there's a
wild.
lot,
And I can
there's
hear
a
my
lot of
dad
history.
when saying eye
Yes.
contact, pick up a phone, eye contact, pick up a phone. I can hear both my parents saying it. And it's true. It's totally true. And we see it in spades when we go into these organizations, and especially with intern programs when we're fortunate enough to work with them, the set of expectations around it is so different. But to your point, Julienne, we see so often the Peter principle play out, which is that people have been promoted based on a technical skill and are then not given any support or
Yes.
guidance on how to lead people. And that is not an inherently natural skill for most of us. And so what we see is these directors of work. They sit when people are now back in office, but even virtually, they would sit over your shoulder and I remember this from being in finance. No, that's the wrong cell. No, that's the wrong formula. No, that's not how you do it. And that's how we learned. And that's what we were told by our managers. But what we really need in today's world are unblockers of work. So that if Jerome is my manager, Jerome and I have such a fluid conversation and so much psychological safety and foundational communication support that he can say, what's holding you back? And then his role is not to sit over my shoulder and direct that work. His role is to unblock that work so that I can sprint forward, so that the rest of his team can sprint forward. And people who have been promoted based on a technical skill or being really good at their, direct KPIs are not usually taught, how do I unblock for the rest of my team so that we can keep pushing forward? And I think it's a big miss. And that's where you end up in all this micromanaging work again.
I'm interested in that term you just used of unblocking, because I think that's really, I can relate to that. And that's so fundamental in terms of a skill. And of course, it's something that you wouldn't be able to, at least for most people, develop, unless you had some kind of model of that, like you were talking about those great leaders that sort of showed you the way in terms of how they were talking about themselves and not shying away from what their personal interests were and their families, etc. And they brought that into the workplace. But I'm curious about this unblocking thing, and whether you have any examples in your work. It could be recent or older work, but where that you sort of saw that happening as a result of you guys of you putting in a program for an organization. I wonder what that aha moment is for someone.
Yeah, it's so my partner Josh is not on, but has been stepping with me the entire way on building this. We both come from finance, so we both very much grew up in that, looking over your shoulder, watching what your Excels look like, getting into your Excel and changing it, and that's how we both were trained and grew up on Wall Street. We also realized that that was fundamentally not a great way to teach people, because you don't learn a whole lot by that. And then most of our, managers who were doing that had it done to them and didn't know any better themselves. What we've done when we've tried to build out, we do a lot of manager cohorts. So think 20 to 30 people. We usually divide it on first time people leaders. So you've never had anybody under you, not even one person. Your mid-tier people leaders, they're usually managing some direct reports and sometimes some junior managers. And then you've got your senior people leaders who are usually up in the C-suite or right near it, which is they're not managing any direct reports anymore. Everything rolls up to them. We usually block it out like that because the skills that are needed at those different levels are very different. And the delegation and the leadership, what they have to do is it looks different on every day. But if you think of those first time managers, so the person who has been sitting with all their direct reports and is now leading those people, when we put them into a cohort, we usually do anywhere from 6 to 9 sessions, sometimes in person, sometimes virtual, but 6 to 9 sessions really focusing on things like communication, on things like storytelling. So how, Julienne, you were talking about how you made yourself vulnerable early on, and that really helped bond you with the interviews. How do you do that if that doesn't come naturally? That came naturally to you. You had read it in books, but what if you're a manager where it doesn't come naturally? How do you develop that skill? How do you influence stakeholders? What does persuasion look like when you're trying to both lead up and lead down at the same time? We work on those kind of fundamental skills. We do skills assessments at the beginning, skills assessment at the end. But more often than not, what we can see if we are fortunate enough to work with a client for 2+ years is promotion cycles, both for those managers who have gone through and learned how to not just direct their team's work, but unblock their work through things like influence, persuasion, story, all of that. And then their direct reports who have, as a result of having this manager who's been trained in these methods, now promoted themselves up as well. We're big on, we're data kids. So we will spend all day in a client's data, working with them on ROI. I very much believe that one of the disconnects between traditional HR, and I think this is changing, but between traditional HR and a CFO or CEO is the way that they talk about numbers and data and what they're trying to show each other, which doesn't mean that HR doesn't understand numbers and data. I think they're often just looking at different numbers and data than what the CEO and the CFO are actually looking at to make their decisions around. And so we will often bring together a group of CHROs for an offsite or for a learning day. And a lot of what we'll talk about are levels of data. You can go 3-4 levels down into data, how you're turning that data into storytelling, what data is actually fueling those ROI numbers that are important to them. Because if you do want that seat at the table, and that's something we've all heard too many times, CHROs need the seat at the table. If you want that seat at the table, for right now anyway, you've got to talk their language too, right? And so a lot of what we do is how can we help you look for the numbers that you need to put into place to make these arguments, to make your vision and the work that you're setting out more powerful and more adaptable to the overall company goals and vision.
I want to go back to your bosses for a minute because you
Yeah.
said to give them a moment to shine out there in cyberspace. Um, They encouraged you, or it sounds like they pushed you out the door onto the tarmac and onto the plane to go to other places to learn where you weren't comfortable. You're like, I'm not ready yet. I need to learn more before I go. But when they did that, I'm going to assume there was an element of risk because you could make a mistake, could make maybe many mistakes in the learning process. But I think that's something that gets missed by a lot of organizations because you have somebody, you clearly said, well, they weren't ready and they're going to they put them someplace that sort of failed, but they were still on their feet and they learned something. And then a lot of times in companies, they write them off like, oh, there was that situation. I was like, redeem them and put them someplace else, and
Or if
let's
anything, that
relearn.
person's more valuable to you now. They have
Yes,
that
they've
experience,
suffered.
which somebody else
Now
doesn't.
they have,
They've gone
yeah,
through it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
No,
that's
that's
something that's
absolutely the
learned,
case.
or it's seen as, oh, they're not perfect anymore. They're not hypo. Well, maybe that's a new one we need to think of, or a different way to look at,
Yeah,
those
I think the
trial and
hypo
errors.
thing is tough too because it's also there's opportunity and potential and there's also time. And I think sometimes people look at these hypo programs as like such a flashpoint in time. And just because
Hmm.
somebody didn't fit that right now doesn't mean in 4 months that they aren't a
Mm.
perfect candidate for them. But once they've been passed over a program once, they often don't come back to them again. And I think that can be a real, I hope, I
Hmm.
naive maybe, but I hope that's part of what all this data collection and an AI will eventually help us do is not just say, listen, I'm really lucky. I have Yale on my transcript. I have Columbia on my transcript. I have big banks
Hmm.
on my transcript. So when they're just going through at a really high level, they're going to say, okay, sure, put her in that. Doesn't mean that I am by any stretch more qualified than anybody else who should be in that program. But we for so long have looked at these outdated markers. And so I do hope, like you're saying, that some of this, the risk reward will look different with data analysis instead of just human analysis around it and say, well, Julienne already failed. So actually, she should be in
Mm.
that not list because she's got the guts to get up and try again. She's got the experience under her belt of that. And the odds of her failing again, as opposed to really trying to prove herself this time, are different. So let's double down and reinvest in her because we've already reinvested in her once with good reason because we knew she could do it. She didn't kill it that time, but maybe she will on the next one.
Hmm. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, that's thanks for that, because that to me is really the role that I see for storytelling, is kind of bringing all these elements
Hmm.
together, so that we're looking at data, we're looking at the human side of things, we're looking at where somebody comes from, not just from an educational background, but from many different sides of it. And I do believe that the ability to tell a story uh, comes from the ability to actually bring different parts of it, and
Mm-hmm.
stories are the way that we understand things that happen. And so it is one of those things where, and I know you've talked about this too, because story is part of your programs, but when you can marry that, when you can combine data and story, then it becomes a very powerful communication tool.
Oof,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of, I'm looking at the clock here, and I want to make sure that there's one more thing we hit on before we give you the floor to tell us what you'd like to leave our audience with. But we mentioned at the top that you're a mother of three, soon to be four. You're an entrepreneur. You've had this career in finance, in addition to now being with this business, creating this business since 2018, and the ups and downs that go with that. Um, and a lot of people that we've had on the show have talked about employee well-being, employee wellness, life work balance. One of the people that we had recently said, that he kind of rejects the idea of work life because it's just life. It's all
Totally.
life, and it's finding balance in that. But I wonder, from your perspective as a mother, as a family person, as well as an entrepreneur, where do you see that going? How do you make it all work?
No, I love that rejection of work life because I do agree that it is just life. I think I hope we're getting past what you were describing earlier, Julian, which is and I certainly grew up with this in finance. I remember people telling stories about, oh well, Margot is so intense. She was on her BlackBerry. Now I sound old, but she was on her BlackBerry when she was getting wheeled into labor and delivery, and then she was on it
Oh yeah.
afterwards, and then
Oh yeah.
she didn't take her mat leave, and she was back 2 weeks later. You're sitting there as a 20-year-old woman and go, oh God, okay, that's what we do. Okay, great, good to know. That's, yeah, great. And so you don't know any better, and that's what you're told. And I think hopefully that is starting to go away a little bit. This idea of women have to whitewash it off their walls, that they don't have it anywhere. That fathers also are more open about, I'm going to take a leave. I am going to do these things. I'm going to be invested in my home, and that's important to me. I think, and this is a can of worms we're not opening on this one, but remote work has had pros and cons, and I feel differently about it depending on how much time of day you talk to me about it, candidly. But for somebody of my age, of childbearing years, it has made it possible for me to, my due date's next week and I'm sitting here doing the podcast with you. I'm due on Monday, it's great. So I can still sit here and do this, which would be really hard in an office setting. And so it has made a tremendous amount of difference. I also think about myself at 22 and I was in a, bedroom, apartment with like 6 people in it that was probably for 2 people. And you didn't want to work from there. There was, there was nothing good happening there. So
Oh,
I think
yeah.
it has hit at different points of your life. But in terms of work life, I try, and Jerome, you reference this, and I appreciate you acknowledging it. I try to be very, very open about the realities of it, which is that it's really hard. It is never fun. We have a kid in a sleep regression. We were at storage this morning picking up cribs and things we need. Here doing this, I have some client calls that I need to pick people up from camp. That's just how it looks on any day. And I think the more that people acknowledge it, the better. I also think it's really important to acknowledge how much help a lot of us have, because I find that a lot of people talk about balance and coordination and they fail to mention, and I have a housekeeper 3 times a week and a nanny 4 times a week. And that there's no shame in that. I have a housekeeper who comes once a week and a nanny who is there 5 days a week. There's no shame in that. I just think it's very important for people to be very open about the different tools and the different levers that people use to make that work. I rely on in-laws, I rely on a combination of family support and paid support, and I rely on great flexibility from my clients, all of which without I could do none of this. And so it's different levels at different points in time, but the more that people share, I hope they share the gory realities of it, in addition to the, this is how I time block my calendar, which is all well and good. And in my experience, time blocking works out 50% of the time at best, which is awesome for that 50%. And it still means you have to adapt constantly for the other 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And I appreciate that openness that you have. And I can testify to it, because that's really what inspired me to reach out to you, to have you on the show, actually, was that, on LinkedIn, there are many stories that you have about your family as well as about your clients, and, everything basically. And it's very inspiring to me, because I can sort of relate. I remember one of your stories, just really quickly. I think you were at the airport and there had been some cancellations, or somebody was sick, and you had 3 kids around you. And I could just, and there was a picture of you. I think it was you and your husband and the 3 kids, and everybody looked really exhausted, but you were there together in the airport. And just recently I came back from a vacation. Our plane was delayed, many hours. And then I actually thought of you in that moment. I was thinking, well, she went through this, she got over it. We can do this too, So I think it's really important to see those kinds of stories, especially on the LinkedIn feed, where people sort of, I know it's much more open than it used to be, but for a long time, it was kind of a resume holder, and so all you saw were really positive things about people, and that's still the case.
Very curated.
Very curated. Which, like all social media, let's be honest. But still, I think it's very refreshing when you see that, and it is reassuring. It's comforting. It makes you feel like you're not alone in juggling all these things. And the second thing that I really appreciate is, if you need support, get it. And absolutely, there's no shame in that. So I really encourage everyone to go and check out Liz's LinkedIn and of course Kunik as well, because you're doing great work. And on that note, I'd love to just as a final question, give you the floor, and if there's anything that you want to leave our audience with, that you think people should be thinking about right now, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. The 2 are really what I talked about before, which is that I'm very worried about ERGs and their future at companies. And I'm very worried about our managers. And so we've been doing a lot of pro bono, going in, talking to a lot of associations and organizations about what this looks like and how we can make it happen, and ways, even, low budget or no budget, how you can help these ERGs stay invested and grounded, how you can try and hand your managers something more than, a few LinkedIn learning videos, and ways to even create internally on your own peer learning cohorts, because I am deeply passionate about this idea of learning with peers. I think it is missing from our workplace, and I think it's fundamental to creating a stronger workplace. So if anybody wants to talk through any of that, LinkedIn is definitely the best place. And I'm always happy to just get on a call, listen to what you're working with, and share any examples or situations we've worked on that are similar and might be applicable to you. So please do not hesitate to reach out anytime. We also do events, and I'll post those online, but we tend to find a lot of people are on vacation in July and August. So we don't do a lot of events in July and August, but we'll be ramping them back up in September. So you'll see those posted on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. And all of these will be, these resources will be in our episode notes as well. We'll make sure to put links in there so it's easy to find Liz and to find Josh, your co-founder, as well as Kunik, the organization, and all the events you're holding, and the resources that you're offering pro bono, which is really great to hear in terms of associations and that sort of thing. So again, I really encourage everybody to follow your work, and if our listeners today have been inspired by this session, you can go to narrative.com, NARATIV.com, where you'll find a lot of resources as well. And you can consider enrolling yourself in one of our programs around storytelling. We talked a little bit about that today. That's really what we specialize in. Right now, we do have a special gift for all our listeners because we've partnered with the New Mexico State University's Global Campus, where we created an on-demand, self-paced storytelling training where you'll learn to find, craft, and tell stories for interviews, leadership presence, and pitches. And if you use code NARRATIVE, NARATIV, you'll get a special 25% discount. And that's just for you listeners, to thank you for being with us, as always. So thanks a lot again. And I want to thank you again, Liz, for being with us today. I want to thank Julienne for being my wonderful co-host. Yes. And you have one
final thought. It
yes,
works.
Please.
So, it's just not, it actually works. And I'm proof for the pudding for that, if that's even an old expression, but still, it does. It's a game changer. So little steps, but just try it out. You'd be surprised. So.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks
it's always
for
a
that.
joy. I'm always sad when it's over, and I'm like, oh, I could have stayed here a little while longer. And
I know. I wish we had more time. But that's the time we've got. And again, a big hearty thanks for everyone listening. And as always, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and also go to our YouTube channel. All of this drives the word of mouth so that more people can gain the wisdom and insights from people like Liz today. So until next time, thanks again, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.